Hello, I'm Ezin from the University Islamic Society. We're going to start off with introductory speeches. So I'd like to invite, if Mr. Udah Khanfar would like to start us off, that'll be fantastic.
Okay. Good evening. And actually, I thank both of the organizers for this magnificent function. Now, I have come from a region where for the last, how many years? From 2001 until today? A lot. I have been covering conflicts, wars, genocides, chaos, and destruction. And when that scene is projected to the entire world, a lot of descriptions and theories and analysis is produced around it. My feeling about this always that most of these analyses, especially the Western-centric ones, projected by media and sometimes by intellectuals, is in fact not going deep into the matter. Because there are patterns and frameworks of analysis implemented in a region where very few people had the knowledge and the understanding of the actual things happening. Amongst them is the issue of relationship between politics and Islam. A lot has been said about that, and I have heard a lot of analysis and speeches and conferences trying to describe the situation in the Middle East by focusing on certain kind of perception, most of the time biased one, about Islam and the Islamic relationship with politics, or the definition of the theoretical framework, the Islamic one on politics and democracy and so on and so forth. I have come to realize, thinking about events that go through my mind in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and the rest of the entire region, Palestine of course, included, that the issue in the Islamic world is not an ideological issue. It's not an issue of whether Islam has a favorable opinion about democracy or it does not have favorable opinion about democracy. Whether Islam or the so-called Islamic State, is in fact a modern, progressive institution, a liberal one or not. Whether Muslims but the religious practicing Muslims have certain thoughts about the role of women or not. It's not an issue. What has been happening in our region is not a product of that kind of traditional, classical understanding of Islam that a lot of analysts and a lot of scholars, especially in Western institutions, would like to invoke in order to understand what is happening. Simply what is happening in our region and in the Islamic world is the fact that we have been going through authoritarian tyranny for the last at least 100 years. We are going through certain kind of, atmosphere, political one, where our freedom has been always confiscated for the sake of certain interests in our region. Some of this is colonial interest, Western interest, geopolitical interest, and for the sake of all that, the concept of freedom has been sacrificed for something else called stability. And I really feel frustrated when I sit in think tanks in Washington and in London and the rest of Europe, and then I hear people who's supposed to be product of liberal Western democracy, preaching us that stability is much more important than freedom at this moment in time, or than democracy, as if stability could be achieved through tyranny and dictatorship. It is not an issue of Islam that we are going through at this moment in time. It's not an issue that Islam did not lead Muslim societies to liberal democracy as it happened in the West, for example, or the fact that we did not have the progress that Western societies had. We had enlightenment about 1,000 years ago. We had also reformations. We had a lot of, dynamic, interactive life in theology, in politics, in philosophy, and in science that we produced to the world long time ago, long time before the 17th century, and 16th century reformations in Europe and Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. We had all of that. The issue is not about Islam and politics. The issue about people who have used that region and they have exhausted that region and they have taken from us the worst, because once your dream is sacrificed, once your hope in a just future is confiscated, the worst normally comes out of you. This is why we had Al-Qaeda. This is why we had ISIS. I remember when I was a director general of the Al Jazeera network, that when we were covering at Tahrir Square in 2011, Muslims and Christians, Islamists, liberals, pro-Arab nationalists, everyone, men and women, boys and girls, old and young, were unified on democracy, on social justice, on freedom and liberty. The issue then was not a discussion about religious doctrine or an issue of justification whether Islam accepts or does not accept. It was an issue that all of us were united on having a future that every society in the world loves to see. But when that hope was confiscated and when that dream was murdered, everything after that became complicated. The same people who marched in a Tahrir Square next to each other, they found themselves in jail, and the rest, desperate in order to retrieve that kind of a dream, they might have resorted to violence, to extremism, even to terrorism. I remember in 2011, when we were reporting about the Arab Spring, there was nothing called Al-Qaeda. I don't remember news about Al-Qaeda for almost 6 or 7 months of Arab Revolution. Why? Because Al-Qaeda can market its vision when there is a serious situation of lack of hope. But when people have hope in their future, when people are marching towards a great destiny of freedom and democracy, Al-Qaeda does not have anything to say to the Arabs or to the Muslims. The same ISIS, which, by the way, was born after the coup in Egypt and after the destruction of the Arab Spring, and when people as well lost hope in the political system. Why all of that happened? Was it because of Islam? No, it was not. It was because the entire world, and I say this, and I am very sure about what I'm saying, the entire world, especially the Western world, stood silent when the dream of democracy in the Arab world was murdered. For now, and that was in 2013, until today, I can't even hear the word democracy uttered by any Western politician or American politician about our region, as if democracy has become a taboo. And then we are blamed for producing this kind of violence. These extreme ideologies that emerged in our region are not, and we will never regard them as representatives of Islam or Muslims. We have suffered from Al-Qaeda and from ISIS and all this kind of form of extremism. We have suffered because it is in our territories, in our land, within our boundaries that all of that is happening. But we will continue fighting for democracy and the freedom. And this is the only way that we can actually come up with magnificent ideas about ourselves, about the past and the future. I do not undermine the necessity of grand debate about Islam and the future, Islam and politics, Sharia, the concept of democracy. and Islam, the concept of economics and Islam. All of that should be discussed and debated. And we need to have a new approach to all of that as Muslims. But that could happen when you have the freedom to discuss, when you have actually the balanced society that allows this form of free environment to create a new atmosphere, new ideologies, new discussions happening in our countries. But when we have tyrants using religion and using religious institutions to affirm their control over the societies, using mosques and the speeches and religious discourse in order to justify atrocities against humans, and all of that is done in collaboration with Western governments and silence of the international society, because these puppets were introduced to the West as the agents of stability in a region that is going through chaos. That narrative should be actually dismissed, because stability only can be achieved when people who believe in democracy and freedom and justice are in power. This is going to be the destiny of the region. Without it, we will always continue to hear bad news about a region called the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And Professor Brown, if you'd like your time.
I guess I'll stand up. Hopefully, I wore a nice tie. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for organizing the event. It's a big honor to be here, and the venue is fancier than I expected. This is actually a very fortuitous time to have this discussion. When I was looking through the program, I kept thinking about the kind of endless times that you ask the question, is Islam are Islam and democracy compatible? Is Islam and religious freedom compatible? Is Islam and secularism compatible? Whenever these discussions take place, there's always a clear power dynamic present, right? So the standard is set, and then you see, does Islam match up to the standard? The standard is set, does Islam match up to the standard? And the people setting the standard are us, and us are people of the West. So the West sets the standard, does Islam meet the standard? This is a moment in history, I think, that it's in a way fortuitous and productive to ask these questions, because we in the West, we the standard setters are on a back foot. Whether it's the threats of populism and the challenge it presents, whether it be Brexit in the UK, or the fact that the president of my country is like a nativist, xenophobic id. I hope it's okay to say that. Or other challenges that are maybe equally intimidating, right? The problems have been exposed about male-female relationships in the workplace, about that dynamic in various industries. How do we deal with questions of proper propriety between genders and relationships in the workplace or in society in general? A lot of the sort of fixed points of inquiry or certainties that maybe people had in the West about who we are and how we do things, these have been challenged. There's a lot of questions internally. I hope that tonight when we discuss these issues, when we discuss the question of Islam and the Islamic law, you'll see that the Islamic legal tradition, the Sharia, is an incredibly dynamic, diverse, rich, engaging tradition that's capable of adaptation, that's capable of change. And if you look at those instances of rigidity or severity or fierceness, you often find that what's behind that is not some inherent trait or feature of the Islamic legal tradition, but rather there's a power dynamic there. There's a threat, there's a fear about loss of autonomy, there's a fear about loss of identity. And that goes back to that initial power dynamic I talked about before between Muslims and the other, between Islam and the West. So at this time, I think that we can kind of move the discussion away from simply looking at Islam and does it meet a certain standard, to asking also real questions about our own societies, the West. What is the West? Is the West a racial unit? Is it a cultural tradition? Is it a religious tradition? Is it a set of ideas? In which case, how does that set of ideas interact with other ideas? Who can it make room for? When we talk about democracy, what are the outer limits of democracy for us? What are its unspoken assumptions? What are its Grundnorms? Who's really allowed to participate? Who's really allowed to make decisions or to influence policy? When should voices be excluded? When we talk about liberalism, there's the famous Mill rule. You can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anybody. What do we mean by harm? What do we mean by hurting? These words that we often throw around, and we have a very hard time defining, because when we have to define them, that's when we have to ask the really hard questions. What do we mean by harm? What do we mean by consent? What do we mean by autonomy? The Islamic tradition has a tremendous amount to contribute to these discussions. Muslims are part of the West. And Muslims and their tradition have a real contribution to make in this moment of questioning, in this moment of uncertainty, as we all try to ask questions about who we are and what our values in the West are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both our speakers. So let's just pick up on something that was just said then about Sharia law. So this is Islamic law. So this has become a buzzword in political discourse, a phrase used to inspire much fear. So, Professor Brown, what is Sharia law? So many countries, Malaysia to Morocco to Iran, claim to be implementing Sharia law. Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong?
So Sharia in Arabic means it's basically the idea of God's law. It's God's law. And if you go to the bookstore, you go to the library, you say, can you get me the Sharia books out so I can see what the Sharia says? There is no Sharia book. Just like, for example, if you go and you say, go to the library and I want British law. Can you show me what British law is? No, it's not British. There's, the laws of this subject or that subject. Or in America, there's a law of the state of Maryland, law of the state of Virginia, right? So the Sharia isn't sort of a body of law as we think about it as like a set of books or rules. It's a legal tradition that Muslims developed based on the scripture of Islam. The Quran, the revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad, which is a very small, by the way, I'm Muslim, I should say that, in case people want to, why is this guy saying this? Oh, I'm Muslim. The Quran, the revealed word of God to the Prophet Muhammad, and then the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the precedent of the early Muslim community, and then the generations and generations of Muslim legal reasoning and questioning and answering that goes on for centuries and after that until today. So the Sharia is a tradition, a legal tradition that seeks to answer the question, what does God want from us? What is right and wrong in God's eyes? The actual answer to that question is called fiqh, F-I-Q-H, fiqh. Fiqh means understanding. That's law in the sense of if you went and got a book of property law, family law, torts law, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a human attempt to answer the question of what God's law is. And therefore it's necessarily, inevitably diverse, inevitably human product. And some of it can be changed, clearly. Some people don't want to change without very good evidence. And a few points that everybody agrees on in the Muslim community, people don't see these things as changeable. So that's Sharia. In terms of what, who does it right or where is it implemented, most Muslim majority countries and some non-Muslim majority countries, like for example Greece or Israel, right, have some aspect of their legal systems that's derived from the Sharia tradition. In countries like, let's say, Jordan or Egypt or Syria or Israel, or for the Muslim minority in Greece, the family law, things like marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, things like that, this is all inspired by the Sharia tradition. Some societies have, or some countries have Sharia judiciaries, but they also include aspects of international or like Western, either civil or common law. So for example, Iran, which is an Islamic state, a Sharia judiciary, or Saudi Arabia, or Sharia judiciary, aspects of their law codes actually are imported from or borrowed from or admittedly taken from international law or European law or, in the case of Iran, pre-Islamic Revolution law. And then, of course, you have some, the Sharia, unlike, let's say, law of England, is not a law that is always something that sees the inside of a courtroom. So, like Jewish law, the majority of the Sharia has nothing to do with, getting sued or litigation or contracts or things like that. It has to do with how do I pray? How do I perform my ritual ablution so that I'm in a state of purity in order to pray? How do I perform the Hajj? If I'm cooking dinner and I accidentally eat something when I'm fasting Ramadan because I'm tasting the soup, have I broken my fast? Do I have to make up the day of fasting? How do I act towards my parents? How do I, what do I do when I'm reading the Quran? Can a woman touch the Quran when she's menstruating? Questions like this. These are questions that are never going to see the inside of the courtroom, but these are actually the bulk of the Sharia. So the Sharia is present wherever Muslims are present, even if it has no representation or no recognition by a state or in official law, because the Sharia is the way in which Muslims talk about their ritual lives and their ethical lives. And so it's present wherever Muslim communities are. About who has it right and who has it wrong, there's a big debate, which I'm not going to be able to answer in the next few minutes.
Thank you. So no Muslim country is classified as developed, and very few have developed civil and political rights. This is often pointed out as, in fact, a reason to fear Muslim immigration in the developed world. So my question to both the panelists is, do you think Islam has prevented Muslim countries from progressing in some way?
Should I answer this? Okay. Now, the question is the following. The Islamic world, or Islam itself, has a comprehensive description of what the human being on earth is here for, the concept of purpose and meaning. And therefore, we have 1,400 years of a civilization and evolution of Islamic concepts that has been interacting with reality and generating paradigms and ideas about how Islam and Muslims should conduct their affairs and how should they perceive their presence within this life. So we do have concepts of progress, and the concept of progress simply is based on the idea not only of material approach to reality. It's not about materialistic progress. It's actually a combination of prosperity that could be achieved through justice and could be achieved through economic development and so on, but also, more importantly, on issues of morality and ethics and purpose and meaning. So it is a combination of both. What would you like to describe that? I don't know, because the concept of progress, as I understand, is a product of a Western culture and civilization, and it has its roots within the philosophical discourse of enlightenment and modernity. While in Islam we had, as I said, what could be regarded as equivalent to progress or to modernity or to enlightenment, which is not necessarily following exactly the same definition, because we do not believe in the Muslim world in the separation between what is materialistic and what is value-centered, the meaning and the materialistic, for example. So both of that is unified under one discourse. In my opinion, the Islamic world issue of progress, we had, just up to colonialism, for example, we had great examples of communities that were progressing not less than any other Western government. For example, Egypt under Muhammad Ali in the 19th century, for example, was going through that track and things were going very well. The issue was interrupted, the progress in our community, if you would like to use that terminology, was interrupted by colonialism, then interrupted by the aftermath of the First and Second World War and the complications that has come into our territories since then. So the idea is, would Islam has prevented? Of course not, because there is, when you speak about Islam, and you go now to this, I have been in a lot of Muslim countries covering conflicts. I don't remember something that has happened just because of Islam. People could use the word Islam. Governments use Islam sometimes to justify their action. Sometimes they use the concept of Sharia or certain concept of Sharia, narrow-minded approach to what they regard as religious, in order to justify their authoritarian rule and the confiscation of the right of the public to elect their representatives to government. It has happened in some of our countries. Governments use religion sometimes but religion per se, on its own, it is very dynamic because scholars, intellectuals, and the public are always invited to debate and to discuss and to produce solutions for their reality. And there is nothing, as Professor Jonathan said, it is not an issue of certain kind of dogmatic approach which is in a way or another not dynamic or not flexible. Actually, it is not. I would refer to what's happening in the Islamic world right now. Yes, there is a lot of discussion taking place about Islam and public sphere and politics and economics, but it has never been an issue. The discussion was interrupted for the last 1 century because of priorities of politics and priorities of colonialism and revolutions and corruption and so on and so forth. Had that not been interrupted, I am sure by today we would have much better understanding of Islam and economics, or a theoretical a framework on politics and Islam and so on. But unfortunately, that was sidelined under a heavy pressure of a security state and tyranny and Western intervention and colonialism and many other things that have happened since then.
So, so to move on to, you spoke about there's this many things that we're talking about that we're trying to find out if they're, we set a standard for whether something is compatible with Islam, whether it's compatible with it. And you challenge on some of those assumptions. But there's still some fundamental issues that I think people regard as very important, like religious freedom. And then many people would say, Islamist parties across most of the Muslim world tend to be on the side of the argument that is against religious freedom. And many people feel, if you privilege Islamic law, then you're oppressing religious freedom, which is a very fundamental right for many people. So can Islam ever accept religious freedom and equality?
Oh, why am I grabbing the microphone? Sorry. You looked like you were offering it to me. I didn't want to be rude. Let's just think about these questions. About the question like development, progress, religious freedom. You can't just say these things. What do we mean by this, right? So, if my religion says I have to chop off Hasher's head or one of his relatives' head every Thursday, then you're going to say, no, I don't accept that religious freedom, right? And if I say my religion demands that I pick up my phone and look at it every 5 minutes, you'd be like, okay, that's fine, that's not that big a deal. And somewhere between there, we're going to come up with a line where religious freedom should stop, right? So the question is, where is the same thing with freedom of speech? Where are the lines getting drawn? Who gets to draw the lines? Whose input is taken into account when we're talking about where those lines get drawn? Whose feelings get taken into account when we're talking about where those lines get drawn, right? So it's very interesting to think about religious freedom, right? Not in the United States, but in other countries, you have hate speech. So there's certain things that a Muslim might say as part of their prayers that someone else might say, that's intolerant, that's hate speech. You're criticizing Judaism, you're criticizing Christianity, you're criticizing unbelievers, you're being intolerant. That's very un-British, right? It's not a British value to not be tolerant of others. So this is intolerant. If a Muslim says things that are actually technically required in their religion, for example, it's a very controversial debate, but these things have to be mentioned. The issue of Ahmadis, the Ahmadi Muslim community. Are Ahmadis Muslims or not? The consensus of Muslims, Shia and Sunni Muslims, is that Qadiani Ahmadis are not Muslims. But if a Muslim says this, if a Muslim simply says what the consensus position of their scholars is, that is considered intolerant, and in some society, in some legal systems, perhaps in Britain, right, this is considered an opinion that needs to be countered, that maybe it should not even be allowed to be expressed, that is dangerous in and of itself. In the United States, that's not the case. In the United States, these opinions can be expressed freely because we have constitutional protection, freedom of religion, that's stronger than other countries. By the way, it's one of the few times you're going to hear me saying positive stuff about my country. So, enjoy it. My point is, different countries have different ideas of where, even within the West, about where the boundaries of freedom of religion are. So when we talk about is Islam compatible with freedom of religion, what are we, where are the lines here? For example, if you go to a Muslim country, let's say a Muslim country has a law that says it is illegal to proselytize, for evangelical Christians to come and proselytize to Muslims. And it's illegal for someone to go out, even if they're Muslim, to go out and say bad things about the Prophet Muhammad, or to say Muslims should renounce their religion and stop praying. A lot of people say, no, that is a restriction of freedom of religion. People should be able to proselytize, and people should be able to go out and make these statements. But then think about the UK. Just in 2015, I don't know what happened with the laws, but the UK Parliament was mulling laws about restricting certain kind of Muslim expression. That Muslim preachers were saying things that were considered contrary to British values because they were intolerant or disrespectful of others. And Muslims, for example, should be prohibited from saying that you shouldn't vote. I remember this was one of the things that came up in 2015. So if the British government, conceivably, right, if the British government is saying, maybe we should go out and prohibit people from saying you can't vote, prohibit preachers from saying this, because this is contrary to our fundamental British values. What happens in a Muslim country if a Muslim government says, we don't want people going out and saying things in the street that are against our fundamental values? Would that be a restriction of freedom of religion? Or is that simply a restriction of expression that is a counterpart to a comparable restriction of expression in a non-Muslim country? We wouldn't be having these, we don't sit around and talk about freedom of religion in the UK when we discuss these things. We talk about British values. If it's Muslims talking about it, then it's Islam has a problem with freedom of religion. So I'd say the way these questions are phrased always puts the burdens on Muslims. It does not ask the same question of Western countries.
Thank you. But also, let me go back to the ground, again, to the field. I mean, this is not an issue. I don't really know what does that mean practically, because in our societies, the Middle East, for example, is a mosaic of cultures and religions. In Iraq, we had all forms of churches that existed in the world. Some of these churches have survived under the Islamic world or Muslims, and they perished under Western communities because they were not allowed to worship, but in Iraq they were. If you speak about ISIS and the image of ISIS chopping the heads of Christians and the Yazidis or whatever it is, actually Yazidis more than, it is an exception. It has never happened. Our societies have protected Muslims, Muslims have protected Christians and Jewish rights of worship and presence and having their churches and synagogue, and that was regarded as fundamental in our faith. I mean, I remember I was brought up in Palestine where we had Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The issue of having a church or a synagogue, like having a mosque, you cannot do anything wrong to the building or to the rituals. You are very respectful. You deal with these people as you deal with your own society. Muslims dealt with the people of the book, let us say, between two brackets, more gently than the people of the book dealt with Muslims, especially right now, as we say, the rise of Islamophobia in certain countries. And the people of the book terminology does not only include Christians and Jews, it does include actually all organized religions, including Buddhists and Hindus and any other society that Muslims came across. We know that Muslims ruled India, for example, the Mughals, for hundreds of years. And their subjects were Hindus. And they did not kill them. They actually lived together in peace and harmony. They were citizens of the state. So the concept, when you are hearing about it in media or when it is reduced into an image of slaughter and kill and so on and so forth, becomes very dangerous. But practically on the ground, we, as I said, if you study the scope of 1,400 years of how Muslims dealt with other religions, they had been very tolerant to it. Given the situation that I do acknowledge right now, and this is, I think, most of the political parties in the Islamic world, especially Islamists who are participating in politics, they have acknowledged the necessity of the citizenship and the equal civil rights of all citizens of any state, regardless of their religion or sex or faith. And this has been accepted by Islamists, in my opinion, the last 2-3 decades across the Islamic world. So there is no an issue. I mean, there is no issue of whether in Egypt, for example, the Coptic Christian has the right to be an Egyptian citizen equal to the Muslim. Or in Damascus, the Alawites have the right to exist like the other Sunnis. This is not an issue. These kind of issues explode and become toxic when there is an environment of civil wars and confrontations and authoritarian regimes using tools of sectarianism or religious or ethnic xenophobia against other community groups. This is exactly the definition of the situation that we are going through.
So I think now is probably the perfect time to open up to some Q&A from the audience, if that's okay. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll try and get a microphone over to you. So if we could go...
That guy raised his hand.
Yeah, just over there. Yeah.
Hi. Hello, test. Yeah, someone talked about Malaysian Sharia law. I understand you said Sharia law is dynamic. I'm from Malaysia, and in my home state of Kedah in Malaysia, if you're a Muslim and you don't go to Friday prayer 3 times in a row, you get 6 months in jail. And if you're a non-Muslim, you cannot utter the word Allah. So I understand that Sharia you mentioned is dynamic, but from my home state, it's moving toward a direction that's more draconian. So how do you mitigate that flow? And what's your thought on this kind of strict interpretation of Islam?
So you're from which state? Kedah?
Malaysia. It's a northern state called Kedah.
Yeah. Okay. Are you Malay?
No, I'm of ethnic Chinese. I'm non-Muslim in an 80% Muslim majority state.
Malaysia is it's a really, if you study Islam in like the Middle East, it's pretty simple. Okay, you study Islam in South Asia, things start getting more complicated. You study Islam in Southeast Asia, you're just like, just throw out all the books. Nothing makes sense anymore. It's a completely different, the universe of factors is totally other, right? So talking about religion in Malaysia cannot be done without talking about ethnic identity in Malaysia and distribution of resources and power in Malaysia. Right? So things like this, the use of the word Allah in Malaysia makes no sense to Muslims in other parts of the world. The Christians in the Arab world say Allah for God, and if I was, I'm Muslim, I'd be really happy if a Christian said Allah for God. I was like, hey, that's great. Like he's acknowledging, I'm not a monster, et cetera, right? So, but in Malaysia, it is so tied up with who's Malay, who has the right to the resources and the kind of affirmative action treatment that the Malay majority gets. The Chinese, the successful business group, minority, especially there's a lot of Christians, and they're brought in by the British, and et cetera, Indians brought in by the British, and there's so many tensions there. I mean, you can't pick this apart without looking at that other stuff. So, I mean, I'm not trying to get out of answering your question. I just don't think that if you sort of say, what's wrong with the way that people understand Islam in my state, and why are the muftis affirming these rulings or affirming these practices, I don't think that gets you in here, because religious discussions in Malaysia, in my opinion, especially about Islam, are always masking bigger issues about identity, distribution of resources, and power.
Should we go to the next question? Should we go to the hand over here?
Hello, my name is Aida. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina originally. Even more complicated thing. I don't know how much you know about it, but basically we went through a war and a horrible genocide in the early 1990s, and one of the issues was religion. Basically, we were accused of wanting to establish an Islamic state, also one of the things. But it's like, you've said so many interesting things today and this evening, and it's like one of the questions I would like to ask, maybe like 2 reflections I would really love to hear from you. One is about how much Islam is there actually among the Islamic world, I mean the Muslim world, because according to my knowledge and my studies and everything, it's democracy and freedom is actually what Islam embodies. But what I see very often is what I like to call general Muslim inconsistency syndrome. Islam says one thing, but people do like totally different things. And if they were to, totally comply with Sharia and like Islamic law, we would not see all of these atrocities in the Middle East. And another thing is like, whilst doing politics and Muslims in non-Muslim majority countries like Germany and UK, and it's been fascinating for me, who comes from a country where we have a pretty unified Islamic society, while here in the UK is like everyone is praying at different times. It's like the EU, even in Germany, in the UK and elsewhere, is not able to communicate with Muslims in an efficient way because they're not able actually to come to an agreement about what they actually want to. So I would really love to hear your reflections about that. Thank you.
As I said earlier, the issue is, in the Islamic world right now, we are not going through the most brilliant moment. We are not going through the golden age of Islam and Muslims. There is a lot of interruption. There is a lot of psychological issues that have emerged. There are a lot of contradictions and even, theoretical, cognitive, and epistemological issues that we need to address. I'm not saying that everything is perfect. I'm saying that definitely for at least a century or more, we have been going through stagnancy, through some form of, reactions to issues that are coming from overseas, colonialism, Western invasion, confiscation of wealth, and division of the Islamic world. The Islamic world had lost the concept of consensus because the political system in the Islamic world was in a way or another structured for 1,300 years around an issue of having a central authority that represent Muslims in a way or another. But we have lost balance for the last 100 years because of all kinds of contradictions that happened to us. One of the manifestations of losing balance is not being able to sometimes reconcile between the theoretical discourse that we might go or read in the tradition with the contemporary practices or reality that we need to live with. Sometimes Muslims, or some Muslims, because of that kind of contradiction, live in a way or another two forms of life. A life that is Islamic, in-house or in the mosque or within the personal sphere, but a life which is not Islamic in the workplace or in the government or in the economic circles or the banking system. Because this kind of synchronization between the two realms have not been going through, happening smoothly. They were not because of the contradiction that happened in our public sphere. There was no freedom to discuss these issues and to evolve naturally, where Islamic concept of economy, for example, could easily reconcile with the concept of modern economy, or the Islamic concept of politics could easily reconcile with the concept of democracy. A lot has been happening in that area. This is a scholarly and intellectual discussion that should emerge in the Islamic world. We need a lot of that. And now, as I have come to you, almost every month I attend a conference somewhere in the Islamic world with people discussing all these issues. What is good about our crisis that we are going through right now, the realization of the necessity of updating and renewing our thoughts. And this is happening. A lot of intellectuals, religious and non-religious, are sitting together trying to find a way out of dilemma and the crisis that the Islamic world is going through. So again, it is not an issue of Islam, because in my opinion, Islam, as any other religion, has a set of values and rules and laws, but the way that you interact with it, the text could become the text, which is, here the Quran, for example, or the Prophet tradition, is something that only could be understood within the context of its implementation, because you and me will read it and make sense out of it based on certain kind of rules that Islam has, or Muslim scholars have developed over centuries. So I think we need a lot of that work to happen. And what I'm arguing is this could easily happen, and it could become a major priority if we have much better environment in our reality, more democratic environment, more free and liberal environment where thoughts could easily be expressed and people could debate it in order to find solutions based on the Islamic ethics or based on the Islamic Sharia and the modern and contemporary practices.
So I think we've maybe got time for one more quick question. So if we go to the hand right at the back over there. Yeah, just there.
Hello, so I'm a Copt coming from Egypt, so textbook majority Muslim country. And so what I wanted to ask about is that while I agree and you raised some very interesting points about sort of the principles of Islam and how that can manifest itself and how dynamic it is, the question I want to ask your thoughts upon is how relevant or useful is it to sort of analyze and study Islam in this theoretical sort of high politics framework? So for example, in Egypt, the high politics has sort of been moving towards a more tolerant and accepting law system, etc., etc. But at the same time, in the like cultural local level, things, for example, like women wearing a hijab, while it was perfectly normal for loads of women to not wear a hijab back in the like 40s and 50s. That is becoming less and less normal currently. So there's sort of this distinction between what's happening on a theoretical high politics level and within cultural micro, like at the micro level. And while that's not necessarily reflecting of Islam, I'm just wanting to ask how relevant is it to study what the right way is compared to what's actually happening in reality, if that makes sense. So following on from the previous two members' questions.
I just have a clarification. So you said that the high political culture in Egypt has been moving towards like more freedom and tolerance. I mean, because all I read about Egypt is people being arrested for any kind of opposition to the government, any kind of manifestation of political Islamic beliefs, and the president having absolutely no opposition to him, except the guy who actually supports him, right? And under this president, the non-Islamist Abdel Fattah Sisi, raids on gay nightclubs have gone up. Restrictions on selling alcohol have gone, and trading and moving alcohol have gone up. And I'm sorry, but whether or not women being socially pressured to wearing hijab is not as bad as thousands and thousands and thousands of people being put in prison and raped and tortured. I don't see these things as comparable.
Sorry, so to clarify, like what I meant was not as in tolerant democratically, which I agree with you. There are lots of like really oppressive things, and I don't think it's definitely nowhere near like a democracy, or that's not the point I was trying to make. I was sort of trying to make like setting up a church, for example, back in the 40s and 50s, you had to do that like under closed doors and just like the church would open and then people would just acknowledge it as a church. So now that sort of, so as in tolerance in the sense of being more accepting of, say, Christian rights, not tolerant in the sense that it's more open and democratic. Okay. So I'm not denying any of the points you've made, but that's not my question.
Can I answer, or do you want to answer?
Okay, yeah, but I remember an incident that I covered in Egypt, which tells you a lot. I think it was on the 7th of January 2011 when a church was in Alexandria was bombed, and in the night of a Christmas, Orthodox Christmas, was it? Yes, and then I think tens of people were killed, and immediately the government of that time blamed religious parties, and they attacked them, and one of them actually died under torture because of that incident, because the people were investigating, and the government used that incident widely in order to create some new crackdown on Islamists. Later on, after the revolution, we discovered that attack on Alexandria church that led to the crack on Islamic parties in Egypt was orchestrated by the intelligence of the Ministry of Interior of Egypt. And the minister himself went to court, and he was actually, convicted because of this. And the idea here, in my opinion, is the state does not hesitate to capitalize on any kind of division between Muslims and the Christians, for example, in Egypt, in order to gain more authority over the public and to present themselves as the protectors of Christians from Islamists who are about to slaughter them. I think that has been happening not once, but always. Not only in Egypt, in many countries in our region. So again, we go back to politics and the way that our governing institutions are perceiving their role in the society. They are not the guarantors of unity and justice. They are those who are trying to use the division in order to maximize their force and their oppression.
I think the gentleman's question is actually very interesting. It gets at I think a really crucial point, which is, what do we mean by freedom? And what are the ways we can think about freedom? And what are the ways we can think about other people thinking about freedom in a way that we can accept, right? So let's take an example of Indonesia. So until recently, there were no anti-sodomy laws in Indonesia. There is actually a very historically lively and robust sort of same-sex attraction, or like almost kind of a intergender history of art, and like a even classes in various parts of Indonesia that were like between men and women, liminal classes between men and women. And that was never criminalized. It was sort of accepted as part of society. Recently, Western gay rights groups have been moving into Indonesia and saying, we want sort of very formal legal recognitions of the rights of LGBT people in this country. And then what happens? Then you start seeing resistance and start saying, we need to have anti-sodomy laws. This kind of stuff needs to be stomped out. This is what the Columbia professor Joseph Mussad talks about as, he calls it the gay international, right? That certain types of advocacy for freedom and for rights appear to be, to many of the people in other parts of the world, essentially imperialistic. That it's not just Western, it's not just people being free, it's they have to be free in the way that Westerners think about freedom existing. And it has to be that way. And if it's not that way, it's unacceptable. And of course, there's resistance to that. So the question is, in Egypt, what is better? Is it better for people to be able to open churches without any, just nobody talks about it? Christians open churches, they go to church, it's no big deal, they get left alone, right? Every once in a while there might be some kind of problems, the problems get dealt with. But then let's say you say, no, we want really formalistic recognition of rights of Christians, rights of Muslims, equality here, equality there, and suddenly you start running up against the same type of thing we saw in Malaysia, which is fears on the parts of people losing power, losing authority. Those groups start pushing back. And suddenly, instead of that minority having rights that previously existed in substance, if not in form, even the substantial existence of those rights is challenged. So that's the question I would have. I think a lot of Westerners would say, probably most Westerners would say, no, obviously we think that there should be, freedom of recognition, or sort of recognized freedom for all religions, recognized freedoms for LGBT groups. But if insisting on that is causing so much turmoil in other parts of the world, would it be better to simply kind of embrace and encourage existing freedoms that exist, that are there, even if they're not formally recognized in the way that we would want them to be?
Thank you very much. Just to finish off, as I understood, part of that gentleman's question is that, so you speak very much about this Islamic tradition, which is very dynamic and moving, and is stripped of many of these problems that we see in the Muslim world. But the fact that we don't see this type of Islam manifesting itself very often is because there's all these mitigating factors with colonialism, with autocracy, etc., etc., etc. So, as I understood, part of the gentleman's question was like, okay, so what's the point of this pure Islamic tradition then, if it doesn't seem to be having an impact on the ground? If like ultimately everyone else is, it's not really like improving things for the better.
You asking me?
Either of you.
I would just say, like, what are all the problems in the Muslim world? People always talk about the Muslim world having all these problems. Like, what exactly problem? There's some guy who's like living in a village in Pakistan. Every day goes, buys like whatever their version of Cheetos are, eats those, go home, hang out with his family, right? Eats kebab. lots of people in the Muslim world just live normal lives every day. When we think, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with Islam in Afghanistan? What's wrong with Islam in Iraq? Well, I can tell you what's wrong with Afghanistan and Iraq, at least, which is these countries have been completely obliterated now for decades by Western military intervention. So I think we need to be specific about, like, when we say why is, what's the point of this pure Islamic tradition if it's not appearing? It appears in lots of places in the Muslim world. Those places just don't make the news. And they're not concerns of us in the West because, we're not bombing them. Yeah.
Just, to conclude with a story. I was the bureau chief of Al Jazeera in Iraq in 2003 when the war took place. My staff, I had 102 employees. I did not know who was amongst them Shia, Muslim Shi'i, and Muslim Sunni, the two major sects of Islam. I did not know, really. I did not, really personally, until that moment. The war took place in Iraq. I have staff, all of them are working together. When they pray together. When they eat together. When they go for a mission, they go together. There was nothing called, I am Shia, you are Sunni. I didn't know who is who, Actually, until someone called Paul Bremer came into Iraq, who became the general governor of Iraq, and he was the representative of the American forces in Iraq. I was the first person to interview Mr. Bremer. And I asked Mr. Bremer, what are you going to do in Iraq? Amongst the things he said, I'm going to establish a governing council based on sects. So the Shia will have a quota, the Sunnah will have a certain number, and the Kurds will have another number. I said, excuse me, what does that mean? Really, you are going to destroy this country because this is something that it does not exist. We know that the Shia have their own, tradition and custom and religious, maybe rituals different from the Sunnis in a way or another. But it was not an issue. But once you institutionalize it, I remember my words. I said, this is a recipe of chaos in Iraq. He said, no, this is how it's going to happen because the Shia have been, in a way or another, marginalized, and the time has come for them to take over. Just few months after that, when they announced that new elections will happen based on religious or sectarian definition, immediately I started to sense a tension, even in my staff. The Sunni became a Sunni, and the Shia, even of those who are not religious, those who didn't even know the difference between Shia and Sunnah. Once you institutionalize power based on sect and religion or ethnicity, automatically you are going to have that kind of rising fear and tension and jealousy and competition and eventually a civil war. 3-4 years, not even 2 years later, the major civil war between Sunni and Shia emerged in Iraq, thanks to the American brilliant idea of having a governing council based on sectarian foundations. So what I'm going to go again and again. I am a journalist. I have studied things on the ground. I love history, and I know the history of that region. Events in that region, when they happen, they do not happen because they started this morning. The issue of Shia and Sunnah started maybe 1,200 years before Mr. Bremer decided to institutionalize it and make from it a major killing tool rather than an opportunity of diversity and an opportunity of knowing each other and living together with each other. So ignorance in politics, or the usage of politics, or the usage of religion for political gain is very dangerous, and that is the source of our problems. Our issue with the Christians in Egypt, or the Christians in Syria, or the Alawites in Syria, or whatever in any country in the Arab world could be resolved amongst ourselves through conversation and discussion. Religious definition of who is Muslim and what are his duties based on Islam, and the Christian based on Christianity are not an issue. We had Christians and Muslims and Jews living in the Islamic world for the last 1,300 years peacefully. We, the Muslims, have protected Jews in the Islamic world when they were persecuted in Europe. We took them into Istanbul and Constantinople when they were kicked out from Spain, with Muslims as well from there. There was not an issue. But when we have a concept of issue of Israel, for example, then it becomes a political issue. then politics creates another form of definition of religious belonging, and then another cycle of violence. The same when it comes to Christians or Buddhists. Right now we have an issue, for example, with the Muslims in Burma who have been, some of them have been killed and kicked out from. But can we blame Buddhism or all Buddhists in the world because of what's happening for the Rohingya Muslims? I don't think we can. If there is a confrontation happening between Hindus and Muslims in India, can we just blame Hinduism? I'm sure Hinduism as a religion does not stand for killing and massacring and destroying the public. So again, I am very aware of the utility of religion and ethnicity by politicians and political cycles and the way that they try to score and gain credit out of using division rather than unity.
But unfortunately, as I said, that's all the time that we have for the main event this evening. If I could please remind the audience to remain seated until the guests have left the chamber.
Professor Brown, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Please join us in saying a huge thank you to both of the speakers.